The town called her worthless, a barren widow, cursed by grief and cast aside by everyone she'd ever known. But they didn't know the secret she carried in her heart, and the lonely rancher who found her freezing in the snow. He had a secret of his own, a ghost he couldn't outrun. In the heart of a Wyoming blizzard, those two secrets were about to collide, setting off a fire that would burn all the town's lies to the ground. The year was 1872, and the winter winds came down from the mountains like wolves. They scoured the plains until every fence post and every soul was glazed with frost. In that endless cold, a woman named Emily McGraw walked with her head bowed against the wind. She was 29 years old, a widow with no home, no land, and no child. Town gossip had branded her unlucky, barren, useless, and those words clung to her like burrs she couldn't pluck free. Her boots, worn thin, leaked snowmelt into her stockings as she moved down the muddy street of Red Hollow. She stopped in front of the mercantile, her face half hidden. Through the glass, she saw life going on without her. She pushed the door open, the bell jangling too loud, hoping for any kind of work, sweeping floors, stocking shelves, anything. The shopkeeper, a stout man with fat, rosy cheeks, didn't even meet her eyes. He just shook his head, muttering that times were hard. Behind her, two women whispered loud enough for the whole store to hear. "That's the McGraw widow. Poor thing, but not much use, is she?" Heat rose to Emily's face like a brand. She turned and fled, her pride a hot coal pressed against her heart. She went from one door to the next, and every single one was closed to her. By dusk, her breath smoked in the freezing air. There was no fire waiting for her, no bed other than the horse shed she sometimes crept into for a bit of warmth. She didn't cry. She had no tears left. All she carried now was a numb, heavy weight in her chest. Across town, the Callahan Ranch stood like a fort against the snow. Frederick Callahan, known to most as Freddie, was splitting wood behind the barn, his breath puffing white in the twilight. He was 31, a man built of hard work and silence. 3 winters ago, he had buried his wife. She had given him a son, Jaime, but it had cost her own life. Freddie had never forgiven himself. He worked from dawn to nightfall with a quiet fury, as if he could bury his grief under sweat and labor. Inside, little Jaime sat by the fire, his small hands fumbling with a wooden horse his father had carved. He was 3 years old, with a tumble of dark curls just like his mother's. Freddie came inside, brushed the snow from his beard, and crouched to check the boy's boots. He said little. Words had grown heavy in his mouth these past few years, but he lifted the boy into his arms and pressed a kiss against his hair, a small gesture that held all the love he had left. It was near nightfall when their paths crossed. Emily had walked to the edge of town, the cold biting deeper with every step. Her legs grew weak, her vision blurred. The snow spun around her like a veil, and she finally sank to her knees on the trail that led to the Callahan Ranch. She would have frozen right there. But Freddie was returning with a wagon of hay. He spotted the dark shape collapsed in the snow and pulled his team to a halt. He jumped down and knelt beside her, brushing the snow from her face. "Mom?" Her eyes fluttered open. "I ain't worth much, sir," she whispered, the words half delirious. "But let me work. Just let me stay." Freddie was startled. He saw the pride and the shame warring in her face. A woman hollowed out by grief, but with a tiny coal still burning somewhere deep inside. He lifted her into the wagon, wrapping his own heavy coat around her shoulders. She was light as a bundle of sticks. He urged the horses home. When they reached the ranch, Jaime was waiting in the doorway, his eyes wide. He clung to his father's leg as Freddie carried Emily inside and laid her near the fire. He gave her stale bread and black coffee. She ate slowly, as if it were a feast. The boy, curious, crept closer. Emily's hands, though cracked and cold, reached out to warm his small fingers by the flames. The boy didn't pull back. He leaned against her side as if he'd known her his whole life. Freddie watched, his throat tightening. For months, the child had shied away from everyone, but not from her. That night, Emily slept on a pallet near the hearth. Freddie stood watch for a long time, listening to the storm howl outside and the soft, even breaths of his son sleeping beside the stranger. And as he looked at her face in the firelight, he felt a jolt. Under the grime and exhaustion, he saw it. She had his dead wife's eyes, the same shape, the same quiet sorrow. The sight of it scared him half to death. In the days that followed, Emily repaid his kindness. She swept the floors, scrubbed the pots, and mended the tear in his work coat with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Freddie said little, but he started leaving extra bread on the table each morning. His silence was its own kind of language. Jaime followed Emily everywhere. His laughter, a sound as rare as summer rain, began to fill the quiet rooms of the house. She sang to him, told him stories, and for the first time since his mother died, the boy's world was filled with more than just his father's heavy silence. But word of her presence traveled fast. At the saloon, men muttered that the barren widow was trying to snare Callahan. Women clucked their tongues and whispered that she was bad luck. The whispers were led by one man in particular, Silas Blackwood. He was Freddie's brother-in-law, his dead wife's brother. A man respected in town, a man who had never forgiven Freddie for his sister's death. He smiled to Freddie's face, but behind his back he planted seeds of doubt. A man needs a wife, Silas would say to the others, but a man with a son needs a mother. Not some cursed stray. Emily heard the talk when she went to town for flour. The sting was sharp. She returned to the ranch with her shoulders bent, the shadow back in her eyes. Freddie noticed. He didn't say a word, but that evening he placed a second, thicker blanket at the foot of her bed. His care was quiet, but it was there. One afternoon they were mending a broken fence line together. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the wire. He reached out to guide her hand, his calloused thumb brushing against her knuckle. The touch was brief, accidental, but it shot through her like lightning. She looked down, a hot blush creeping up her neck. Freddie looked away too, his jaw tight. Neither of them spoke, but the air between them grew thick with something new, something dangerous. The whispers in town grew crueler, fueled by Silas's quiet poison. Late one evening, Emily overheard a group of women outside the saloon. "He's a fool to let her stay," one said. "She's barren. Can't give him more sons. She ain't worth the food she eats." The words were like knives in her chest. She fled back to the ranch, tears blurring the snowy road. That night, she packed her few belongings. Her husband's old coat, a faded dress. She would slip away before dawn. She wouldn't be a burden to Freddie any longer. She paused by the fire, looking at little Jaime, asleep on his quilt. Her throat ached. She loved this boy as if he were her own. She turned to leave, and found Freddie standing in the shadows of the doorway, watching her. His eyes were dark as storm clouds. He said nothing, but his gaze held her fast. The snow moaned against the windows. The fire crackled. And between them hung a silence thick with everything they couldn't say. Two broken souls on opposite sides of the same fire, each terrified of the fragile thread that was pulling them together. The blizzard hit just before dawn. It came with a shrieking howl, a wall of white that swallowed the world. Snow piled up against the windows, and the wind shook the cabin like a dog shaking a rat. Emily sat by the hearth, her small bundle still at her feet. She hadn't left. She couldn't. Freddie's silent plea had held her there. Now the storm had trapped them all. Upstairs, Jaime woke from a bad dream. He padded down the stairs, looking for his father. Freddie was pacing by the window, his jaw tight. "Pa," Jaime whispered, tugging on his hand. "The puppy. I heard it crying." The day before, Silas Blackwood had been at the ranch. He'd filled Jaime's head with a story about a lost puppy with a hurt paw, hiding out by the old cottonwood tree. A lie. A cruel, calculated lie. Before Freddie could stop him, the boy slipped out the door, into the storm. Emily heard the door slam. She spun around, her heart stopping. The door was ajar, snow swirling in. Jaime was gone. Panic, hot and fierce, wiped away every last trace of her shame and fear. She grabbed a shawl and plunged into the blizzard without a second thought. The wind tore at her, stealing her breath. "Jaime!" she screamed, her voice ripped away by the gale. She kept shouting until her throat was raw, following the faint, disappearing footprints in the snow. She found him huddled at the base of the old cottonwood, shivering violently, his lips pale. She fell to her knees and wrapped her body around his, shielding him from the wind. "Hush now," she whispered, her teeth chattering. I've got you. She sang to him, a lullaby she hadn't sung in years, her voice trembling but steady. Then a dark shape loomed out of the white chaos. It was Freddie. Relief and terror warred on his face. He scooped Jamie into his arms, then turned to Emily. She could barely stand, her body swaying. He lifted her without a word, carrying them both against his chest, and fought his way back to the cabin. Inside, he wrapped Jaime in blankets and forced warm broth between his lips until the color returned to his cheeks. Then he turned to Emily. She was curled by the hearth, shaking uncontrollably. He knelt beside her. "You saved him," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. "I ain't worth much," she whispered, trying to pull away. "Not more than the trouble I bring." His hand clamped down on hers, fierce and certain. "You're worth everything to me, Emily," he said, his voice cracking. "You saved my boy. You saved me from the silence." Tears streamed down her face. For the first time in years, her heart felt something other than shame. It felt seen. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. He just pressed his forehead against hers, his breath trembling. Jaime stirred in his sleep, murmuring her name. Ma. The sound was a key, unlocking the last of her doubts. This was home. The storm broke at dawn, leaving the world clean and dazzlingly white. But the peace didn't last. The whispers in Red Hollow had become a roar. Silas Blackwood had done his work well. That afternoon, a crowd gathered in the town square. Freddie rode in, his face grim, with Emily beside him, and Jamie held tight in his arm. "He's lost his senses," someone yelled. "That woman is a curse." Emily flinched, her eyes dropping to the ground. Then Freddie spoke, his voice booming over the crowd. "You call this woman a curse? You're blind. She saved my son's life in the blizzard. She has kept my home warmer than any fire. My boy calls her Ma, and I'll not hear her name dragged through the mud again." He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Silas. "This isn't just gossip," Freddie roared. "It's poison, planted by a man who would rather see my son freeze to death than see me happy." The crowd turned, murmuring, looking at Silas. "You told my boy there was a puppy," Freddie said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You sent him out into that storm, didn't you, Silas? You wanted him gone so you could take him from me." Silas paled. "That's a lie. She's bewitched you." But the townspeople saw the truth. They saw the hate in Silas's eyes and the fierce protective love in Freddie's. They saw Jaime, safe and warm in Emily's arms. The crowd turned on Silas, their murmurs growing to angry shouts. He backed away, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over, Callahan," he snarled, before turning and fleeing the town. Days later, they were wed at the ranch. It was a simple ceremony, with only a few ranch hands as witnesses. Emily wore a plain dress she had stitched herself. Freddie's voice broke as he promised to honor her, not for what the world demanded, but for who she was. Jaime stood between them, holding both their hands. But as the preacher spoke the final words, they all saw it. Smoke, thick and black, billowing from the direction of the main barn. Silas, Freddie and his men ran, but it was too late. The barn, filled with the winter's hay, was an inferno. It was Silas's last hateful act of revenge. They saved the animals, but the barn was a total loss. They stood in the cold, watching it burn, the flames lighting up the night sky. But as Emily looked at the wreckage, she didn't feel despair. She looked at Freddie, at Jaime, at the loyal men standing with them. "It's just wood," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We'll build it again, together." Freddie looked at her, then at the burning barn, and a slow smile spread across his face. The fire wasn't an ending, it was a cleansing. Spring came, and they rebuilt. The new barn was bigger, stronger. The ranch thrived. Emily, the barren widow, was now the heart of the Callahan ranch. That fall, she told Freddie she was pregnant. The curse was just another lie, burned away with the rest. Her worth was never about bearing children, but the new life was a symbol of the future they had built from the ashes. One evening, they sat on the porch of their new home, watching Jaime play in the yard. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You were right," Freddie said, taking her hand. "The whispers didn't matter." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "They're just noise." "This," she said, gesturing to their son, their land, the baby growing inside her, "this is the only thing that's real." If you were moved by this story of a love that refused to be silenced, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the incredible tales of frontier justice we have coming your way.